Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported, independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow on Twitter at aroundtheempire. Please help build the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Today our guest is Dave Foster, and we discuss the evolution of the military-industrial complex, Cold War weapon systems, and last war-ism. In Dave's own words, quote, "The U.S. status quo model of the military is one composed of advanced conventional forces equipped with modern ships, planes, tanks, sensor networks, logistic capability, and also nuclear weapons. The Pentagon, the broader government, and the industrial base is beholden to the status quo and favored visions of future operations. The Pentagon can modify to a degree for operations, but finds it difficult to adapt structurally to new realities. The primary reasons are financial. Last war-ism and nostrums of future scenarios always vastly outweigh truly fresh thinking. The commitment to the ideas of the past that exist today, as business relationships, existing infrastructure, organizations, systems, plans, and past research, dominate the Pentagon's budget. With rare exception, the entire Pentagon budget funds the status quo," unquote. Dave Foster is a data analyst in the private sector. He's a former Marine Corps pilot and a Defense Department contract and civilian weapons engineer and operations analyst. You can find his writing at antiwar.com. We recorded this on May 12th, 2019. Dave Foster's here, speaking to us from Texas. Hi, Dave. Welcome to Around the Empire.
Hi, Joanne. Thanks for having me.
So glad to talk to you today. So the thing that initiated this interview is an article that Dave wrote for antiwar.com titled "The Pentagon's Days of Future Past." And by the way, nice job with the Moody Blues reference there, Dave.
Thanks.
And while we were chatting via email over the last couple of weeks, we realized that we have about a million things we'd like to talk about. But for today, we're going to start with the Cold War and now the revival of the Cold War and how the various weapon systems, the military-industrial complex evolved during that period and sort of where it is now in something Dave refers to as last war-ism, which is really interesting in the article. For anybody who hasn't read it yet, it'll be linked here in the show notes. And somehow, if we have time, we want to talk about the rivalries too. There's another factor, the rivalries between the different military services and how that plays into the whole mix. Now, Dave, maybe you'd like to tell our audience a little bit about your background before we dig into all that.
Okay, sure. So years ago, when I was a youngster, I had an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. Lived up in New England. My dad was in the computer industry, so I was around that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and generally understood that aspect of technology. My parents were not particularly political. They had pretty conventional suburban mentality. I did not grow up in a military family. There are lots of service members in my family tree, but that all seemed to die out in about the 20th century for whatever reason. So I don't have any grandparents or my father, my wife's father were not in the military. And the school I went to was a bedroom community, and almost everybody in our small school went on to college. People were professionals, and almost nobody went into the military back in the 80s. But for me, I was kind of a jock, and I thought a military might be challenging with what little information I had. So I spent about 7 years in the Marines. I was a pilot, including Desert Storm. And then after Desert Storm and a few years in the early 90s, I got off of active duty and kicking around trying to find a new path in life, new career. I ended up getting a job with a defense contractor in Washington, D.C., supporting the acquisition system, and did that for about 10 years, and then became a government civilian engineer and operations analyst for another 10 years. So I have about 20 years of experience
in the military-industrial complex,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah, and because I was so new to that, when I was in the service, I had no idea that all this existed. It was a mystery to me. I thought maybe the service just called up a vendor and ordered a helicopter or something like that. I didn't understand this big acquisition apparatus, and I started working on uh, air airstrike weapons, surface to air, surface to surface weapons, and the targeting systems, the guidance. And did lots of operations analysis and research and development on those systems, and I think probably have a more thorough understanding of how all that works in a technical and operational sense than most folks. So I'll defer the academic and combat expertise to others, but I think I have a very deep knowledge of how these systems work, and
And just how the whole
yes,
development and procurement process, which is massive, right? So,
and it's massive, and I don't claim to understand it. Nobody does, and I think largely that's by design. The reason it's so Byzantine is to obscure clarity and traceability. But for what it's worth, I do have a lot of experience doing, and any one system cannot do anything. It relies on a integrated system of systems, and so there, by necessity, you have to learn a lot about the overall, at least realms of the system. So anything having to do with airstrikes is kind of perverse. Uh, some aspects of that I thought were interesting from a technical standpoint. I'm not a pacifist, so I'm not against the use of weapons from time to time per se, but I think we've gone far overboard in our use, and there's a lot of reasons that I guess we'll get into in this discussion.
yeah, I tell people that same thing. A lot of my friends and political allies are anti-war and anti-interventionist, and I, I'm anti-interventionist, hands down. But I don't feel comfortable going as far as saying that I'm anti-war or pacifist, because, I mean, ideally, I would love to be, but I just don't believe that we'll ever reach a point unless humanity just completely changes the nature of human nature. People are always going to be aggressive. People are always going to want to take each other's stuff. And I think we're always going to have to be able to defend ourselves. So I'm big on defense if that's what we were really doing here. But this, you know, I've come to realize that we're not just a country defending itself or trying to help others as I thought when I was growing up. We're now an empire, and we admit that full spectrum dominance is our goal. And in the last 20 years, I think we've changed into something entirely different, and we have this huge military industrial complex that just it just lives to feed itself almost now. So it's a whole different thing. So if I really thought that pacifism was something that was attainable, I would be a pacifist, but I don't. So um, yeah. So the Cold War is something that Dave and I have been talking about, and um, well, you might just want to. He mentioned that he's an expert in these various systems and in the kind of work that he does, but he's never been happy with just sort of understanding that piece of it. He's always been interested in understanding the bigger picture, which led you into geopolitical, reading all about everything basically, because you're just, you can't just do that job without understanding the bigger picture, which is something I can really relate to. So you, over time, you said you spent a lot of time learning about the Cold War and how these West, how the military forces themselves evolved, and how the weapon systems themselves evolved too.
Yeah, I think we probably had visions of empire. Going back to the early days. How else can you explain the Monroe Doctrine? How else can you explain westward expansion and that resource and space competition? And then, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. But our means were very limited. That Great White Fleet experiment was ostentatious, but it didn't connote a lot of actual military capacity. And it's really been since since World War II ended, and just with the structure of the national security state and the services. that we've had truly, I believe, an empire. And then in the last, really since the end of the Cold War, the degree has changed to some extent, but I think the nature remains the same. So yeah, my thinking is that these tools and weapons are they're a means to an end, but they're not the end. Unfortunately, we are in a position now where using airstrikes, there is no purpose, and there's no linkage to strategy. So my point in writing that article, knowing a lot about these systems and knowing about the investments we make, is that an airstrike doesn't add up to anything anymore. There's no end of angry 20-somethings with rifles. There's no end of cheap Toyota pickup trucks in the world, and using the expensive apparatus to target these systems doesn't add up to anything. And so my contention that we're investing in an antiquated conception of war where kinetics means something. For example, we have unlimited ability to drop bombs on, say, Afghanistan, a place where we admit we're at a war. There are, of course, lots of other places in the world where we bomb people frequently, and we haven't. There's no such thing as the declaration of war anymore, which is outrageous. But what does it add up to? It doesn't add up to anything of strategic lasting value. So we make these systems. We have capacity. Of course, we're very limited. So when there's no surface-to-air threat, and if our fixed-wing aircraft fly above 15,000 feet or so, unless there's a mechanical problem, there's no real threat. So we can loiter and find targets. And okay, great, we can do that. But what does it add up to? Does it add up to anything in Afghanistan or any of these places? It really doesn't. So we have this capability. It's a limited set when the weather is right, when we're not facing a particularly technologically sophisticated foe. And so we do the only real thing we can do anymore, which is so-called precision airstrikes in low-threat environments. And it just doesn't add up. So you can imagine the amount of bombs that we've dropped on and missiles on, say, something like Afghanistan, or what we're helping the Saudis do in Yemen. These are, I've never been to Afghanistan, but I have been to Yemen. Very not a particularly developed country. And they can absorb an endless amount of, I'm not saying there aren't tragic human consequences, there are, but it's not changing behavior in the way we think it is. So what do we think an airstrike is going to do against China or Russia? It's not going to do anything. Nobody wants to get sucker punched. But then what? These other countries, peers, have the ability to get back at us in a lot of different ways. And this continued investment in antiquated conventional war systems, as if we're back in the 1940s, it doesn't surprise me, because the machine wants to. It's kind of 101 rule for any organization is self-perpetuation, but it doesn't add up to any strategic lasting value.
Yeah, and I mean, the wars that we've been fighting for the last 20 years, in ideal conditions, we have just such superiority over the enemies that we're fighting, but we're not really even winning those wars.
No.
And now there seems to be, I personally have seen, or what I think I have seen, is a very deliberate march toward reviving the Cold War, and and just almost a lust for another peer. What do they call it? A peer level enemy.
Right.
Sure. With Russia and China, like, for example, one of the things that got me thinking about this determination, and I'm not convinced that everyone is trying to push us in this direction, but there's certainly a very powerful faction that definitely wants another Cold War. I can totally understand why they would want it. If you look at it from the military-industrial complex, the war, it's bigger than that. It's it's not just military-industrial now. It's military-industrial, cyber, intelligence, this whole for-profit, war profiteer, warfare industry. You can see why they would want another Cold War. One, they can sort of return to glory days. Two, it's just, it's so easy to justify getting huge and increasing, growing military budgets if you at least pretend to be preparing for war with these peer rival enemies like Russia and China. And once I came across an article, well, first of all, starting with Ukraine, and I'm sure it started before this, but during the period of time when we were trying to help overthrow the government of Ukraine, not long after that, NATO started rumbling for bases, or at least I think they were trying to say that we would never put a base in the Eastern European countries. They were saying they would rotate. They came to some kind of a decision. They'd rotate forces through Estonia, Latvia, all the countries along the border with Russia there. And at first that seemed like a crazy thing to do. And then over time, it became, we became accustomed to the idea. And now we've got, we're flying planes and we've got troops like right up on the Russian border. And I read an article, I think it was around 2015, and it was about how we were doing exercises for tank battles to prepare for some type of a war with the Russians in Eastern Europe, which just seemed completely crazy to me. But the tone of the article was almost like elated that we were
Sure.
finally going to, that some priority was, or meaning or purpose was going to be restored to the conventional land forces and old style tank battles.
Right.
And I thought, okay, well, at least part of this seems to be, a need to justify the older conventional forces that, maybe they're feeling a little bit left out or of lower priority because so much emphasis had been put on special forces, and they had grown in size and in importance, and they were, the cool kids at that point. And it almost seemed like the conventional forces wanted some kind of a comeback. Did you get that sense at all?
Oh, I mean, you can see this periodicity. So Vietnam was unsatisfactory in a lot of ways because it was this quagmire ground war, and even though we had lots of air forces and naval forces in participation, really it was it's a slog on the ground. And then so what happened in the 70s? That America is chastened, and before you know it, our planners are looking at fighting the Russians in the Fulda Gap in Eastern Europe. You didn't see a lot
Yeah.
of those operation plans in, before the mid 70s onward. And it was this lingering dissatisfaction of, like you said, within the military, there are different personalities and there are different constituencies, and everyone does not get on board with the idea that we're going to fight unconventional wars or counterinsurgency. So there are always these other constituencies waiting in the wings for their opportunity. A lot of the systems that we started investing in order to attempt to counter the Soviets in these European scenarios are systems we have today. The Hellfire missile, it was designed for anti-armor. Some of the laser guided bombs that were more advanced than the ones, the first version from Vietnam, were designed for the weather conditions of Eastern Europe, and the longer range inertially aided weapons were designed to attempt to enter. So the second offset strategy, the assault breaker approach, was a way to kind of roll back waves, not the first wave of the Soviet invasion, but parts of that. And then, of course, these systems all got repurposed in the 80s as we started flexing towards the Middle East. It was another theater of competition with the Soviets. But we started becoming very interested after Iran, and then Desert Storm. Going into Desert Storm, there was a lot of pessimism about our efficacy, but then it turned out that a lot of the systems we had developed in Vietnam and in the 70s were pretty good on a flat plane against a not particularly well-trained force, but there were still problems. There were weather problems, there were oil smoke problems. This gave rise to a new generation of GPS-aided weapons from the 90s, and that's really kind of where we are. So that the major airstrike weapons that we use today, the JDAM, the Hellfire, and the small diameter bomb, which has a little bit of range, those are all right out of kind of post-Cold War, but very influenced by operational thoughts of fighting Soviets in Europe, or our kind of Soviet light experience with the Iraqis, and they have some certain capabilities, but the rest of the world watched us, and they started moving. So now you started to see the Soviets not investing in tanks, but investing in surface-to-air systems. And so we see this hubbub about the Turks buying the Russian S-400 when Turkey is also part of the F-35 program. And so that, to me, that already implies some known vulnerabilities. They don't want to have that proximity right there. So these waves, the counter waves, so we get into Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. All the services, of course, were not on board with this idea of ground wars. You may remember that the Marines were perfectly happy to go in with the initial wave, and they said, okay, we're done. We've done our kick down the door thing. We're going to leave. And the Marine Corps actually left in late 2003. But nobody wants to be left out of a war. So once the realization that this thing is going to be going on, they came back. The Navy and the Air Force always were not huge fans of these Army and Marine ground-centric, Special Forces-centric wars. So there have been, you can find plenty of articles and opinion pieces talking about blue water naval war.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
So those constituencies were already there. So we're in a somewhat similar situation as the 70s. Of course, we didn't have that huge societal devastation that we had in the 70s with the draft and all of the deaths. Now it's an all-volunteer force, and the human damage is encapsulated and it's much lower level. But still, the services are playing that counter cycle game now. So counterinsurgency is, it's obviously borne out to be not successful again, like it was not in Vietnam. And so this appeal to appear, and of course, conveniently, the Chinese started spending on their military around 2000. Their economy is growing, and so they've started spending. To hear the China hysterics say that in an unprecedented way, but their spending is still a fraction of ours. They spend maybe not quite even 40% in this past year of what the U.S. spends, and NATO, collectively NATO, with the exception of the U.S., still all of our NATO allies still spend more and have more than the Chinese, certainly more than the Russians. So I think if you just look at that trend, that's a little bit of a signal that enough alarmists can grab onto and go, oh, we got to worry about the Chinese. But I'll tell you what, I'm sure you and a lot of your readers are fans of the work that CIPRI does to collect global military spending. If you look at China's share of GDP spending, and I'm not a fan of, I've actually written on this, I don't like share of GDP as a metric, but if you just match China with everyone else in the world that CIPRI collects data on, China is the curves line up almost exactly. So China is absolutely at the median of overall global military spending, and yet we have all of this alarm. To me, it's evidence of the search for a pretext to keep the gravy train rolling.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Maybe this is a good time. We have a clip from Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He gave. I tend to follow, a lot of what he says, if not everything I can find. And he was at an event in Maine just earlier this month, and we have a clip here that we're both Dave and I like, so we're going to play it here, and then we can sort of discuss some of the things he said. Do you think this is a good time to
that sounds great? And I watched the whole thing earlier today. I thought it was a nice talk.
Yeah. What I appreciate from Wilkerson, I don't always agree with them 100%, although I do feel, closely aligned with most of what he says. But I just appreciate, just like you as a veteran and many others who I seek out to talk to, who are just willing to talk straight up about what they see and what they know. And that's really what I appreciate from Wilkerson the most. So let me just get that clip and play it here, just to refresh our memories on what he said.
Today, we have become what Eisenhower's worst nightmares predicted in his farewell address. We have become beholden to that complex that this year marked its greatest year in history. It sold more weapons than anybody else in the world at a greater total billion-dollar figure than ever before. We are the merchants of death for 7 billion people. Not for that alone, but certainly as a reason or a fallout from that, we now have, by polling data, 3.5 billion people in the world who say that the number one threat to their and their children's future is the United States of America. Dick Cheney, you have succeeded. You always said you wanted to be feared, not loved or respected. Well, you succeeded. Half the world now hates our guts. People in Pakistan, you would think they would hate India, right? Number one enemy. Number one threat to Pakistan is India. No, 88% think the United States is the number one threat to their future. Egypt, 80%. Korea, a signatory ally with the United States, 67% of the people think we're the number one threat to their future. This is an incredible situation we've created, but it is not just because of the warfare state. It has other complicating factors. One of the most profound of those factors is the fact that we now sit in a year and at the end of a decade or two that marks the greatest maldistribution of wealth in the history of this republic. Worse than 1929. Challenge is waking Americans up. We are losing our democracy, if we haven't already lost it, in terms of it being a democracy. We are sacrificing everything that big conflict that I just quoted the iconic five-star general from gained for us. And if you go back to 1946 and 47, you see some very smart people sitting around a table, and then in other places, like the new Pentagon, like across the hill in the Congress, the Senate and the House. You see them in the White House. They're trying to grapple with this. If you go back and you read the archives, you understand that there were some people who understood what was coming and the challenge it was going to present. And they tried to put down in statute the 1947 National Security Act. They tried to put down in statute a mechanism, an institutional fabric, we call it the deep state today, that would both manage this new overwhelming power we had, which they knew outstripped Rome. Rome never even dreamt of the power that we had in 1945. We had 50% of the world's GDP. We made 55,000 airplanes in a single year. We can barely make 20 in a single year now. We had 7,000 ships in the Army. We had over 14,000 ships in the Navy. We have 270 today. We were the colossus of the world. Not only that, the rest of the world that counted was prostrate. France, Germany, England, Japan. We had firebombed Tokyo, burned it to a frazzle, and then just to add pain to misery, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. We were unprecedented in our power. So these people got together and they said, just as important as that day in Philadelphia, that month, that summer, where they crafted the Constitution, they sat down and they crafted this statutory framework very carefully in an attempt to maintain our democracy while at the same time protecting it from external threats. They made a huge mistake, and that mistake was leaving alive something we had never had in our history, colonial or national, an industrial complex aimed at war. Franklin Roosevelt created it and arguably had rationale for creating it. After all, we were going to fight arguably the most efficient, effective army the world had ever seen, the Wehrmacht. But he should have disbanded it after the war. We had never had a standing industrial base for war. Now it eats us alive. Not only does it produce F-35 strike fighters that cost $135 million a copy, $1 million for the helmet the pilot wears, but they don't work. We actually have a defense base that charges us maximum money for crappy products. No one's more aware of that than the military, and they simply don't know what to do about it because the leadership of the military has no moral courage whatsoever. They just simply keep going along with it, and they keep saying, give me more money. I actually heard a chief of service the other day say something like this. This is almost a direct quote. Those damn taxpayers just have to pony up. Give them more money.
So Wilkerson's talking about, the military-industrial complex as if it has gained a life of its own. And I do agree with that to a certain extent. I wish he had mentioned that not only does the military leadership not have moral courage, but, they profit from it themselves. So, they're invested in it themselves. Plus, they've, every single state, for people who don't know, for people elsewhere in the world who aren't familiar with our system here, all of our weapon systems, they're built or designed, or some little part of the work that goes into these is in almost every congressional district. It translates to jobs, and everything else. So everybody's invested in this, and I just don't know how we can unravel it now.
I'll say that I tend to strongly support what he said at the end there about the absence of moral courage and the necessity to keep things going. I'll say the best reading, from my experience, the best reading on the cash flow to the military industrial cash flow is let's just call it some corporate. It's a form of welfare, of spreading money around to congressional districts to keep certain vendors and contractors going. So it kind of a very bare minimum. There could be that case, but the problem is that what we build is not really suitable for the future, and everyone involved. You'll say, look, am I going to come up with a reason for my budget? I'm sure this happens at every small town government. Your budget is X. Could you have a reason to use X? No, who says no? I only need half of X. I mean, that's just not how people in organizations who want to go anywhere function. So the best possible reading is this combination of, it's kind of this insidious combination of spreading the money around through a different alternative path, and then everyone inside these organizations saying, well, if this is what I'm going to get, I'm going to come up with a justification for it. I think that beyond that, it really is just grossly unhealthy. Now, right after World War II, the military massively demobilized, and anyone familiar with our complete lack of preparation for Korea understands that we really did demob. So we didn't just stay at this high level when all of our potential foes and even most of our allies were on their backs after the experience of World War II. What happened is that I think what happened was in a circumstance of not being particularly challenged, especially early on when the Soviets didn't have a really big nuclear arsenal. So why do we get involved in Korea? Why? Because you could say there's a lot of influence there from, quote unquote, and this really drives me crazy, losing China to the communists and when we supported the nationalists, right? So that there's this kind of carryover. Well, we really have to do it here. It's kind of muddling through in Korea. After Korea, we demobilized quite a bit. And Eisenhower there was a philosophy of, war will be nuclear war, and actually we won't really even have nuclear wars because it's so awful. And the conventional forces were absolutely sacrificed in the 50s until this dawning awareness that, you know what, we're probably not really going to be fighting nuclear war. So how would we fight a conventional war? And then Vietnam comes on. Vietnam, more than anything, really was a test bed for a lot of these military industrial projects. And a lot of the stuff we have today is still right out of Vietnam. You know, the kit weapons, laser guided bombs, those things came right out of that. All how all that technology works is right out of Vietnam, and a lot of it even preceded Vietnam. Cluster munitions. Cluster munitions were not originally designed to be area weapons, meaning I've got a bunch of radars out in a big area. It was because the location accuracy, I don't know where that target is. I'm in a Mach 1 jet, and the best I can do, I'm never going to hit that target with a single warhead. So I need to kind of, the way bird hunters use shotguns, I need to just kind of throw this around. And then, you know, a lot of effort went into doing that, and then people came up with new uses. So we did demob a lot after World War II, but I think the tragic part was setting up in a policy way, setting up this national security enterprise that was poised to go out and look for things to do. And then increasingly, as we all know, over the decades, that's become more and more militarized. But it's not a new phenomenon. We've had military involvement in South America, in the Mediterranean, Africa, Middle East. It's just we are in this position now where we have a news cycle, we have a freer flow of information, so it seems a little more obvious. But I agree. I think we've completely wasted away any of the goodwill we had in the world after World War II, and now how can anyone argue that the biggest threat in the world is in the U.S. because we have the most capacity and obvious willingness to, you know, if we have a problem with somebody, next thing you know, there's a drone over your head. And by example, I don't think it's in any way controversial that that's true, because that's how we act.
Yeah, I mean, when you listen to that, and he's citing facts, you know, assuming these polls are credible, and you know, maybe they're not exact, but I think there's other evidence to show that they are credible. And even if you just step outside of this country, you know, in your imagination, and just put yourself in the shoes of other people in the world, what would you think? I think it's very plausible that we are now seen as the biggest threat to most of the people, at least half of the people, most of the people in this world. And I don't know about you, but I'm always thinking, this isn't going to last. This is not going to go well for us. There's going to be a price to pay for this. I think that all the time.
I think because there's I used to travel a lot. I've traveled in a lot of different places in the world, but that was really in the 90s, before 9/11, before we really got active in a lot of places. And I don't have that, you know, experience in the last two decades, but in previous travels, the general sensibility was we like Americans as individuals. Of course, a lot of people had gone to university in the U.S. They had relatives in the U.S. There was always a good sensibility about the U.S. and the people. There was I never really encountered anybody who was a fan of U.S. policy, even back in the much lower profile 90s. And so I can only imagine since then, with the behavior and what's happened since then. We're no longer protected by oceans, and war is no longer a matter of having a big industrial capacity, because there are cyber weapons, there are small weapons with drones. And I know that a lot of the big war mentalities will poo-poo it. How does a nation or a non-state actor or a terrorist transport an armed drone? It's not the same thing as having an intercontinental bomber. I get that, but an intercontinental bomber, anyone can see it, and everyone knows that they aren't going to survive in any sophisticated air threat anyway. So it's just they're not even advantages; they're pointless tools. And the means of wreaking at least small scale havoc are distributed. The world is full of very smart people, some formally trained, a lot of them aren't, and there's tens of millions of really intelligent, clever folks who can build malware, who can build weaponized drones and bring them to go after our. Does it have to be the homeland? We've got bases everywhere. We've got our Navy ships go through the Strait of Hormuz. We've got shipping going through Panama. There are choke points. Our ships and our planes live at airports, and they come into ports. You don't have to fight somebody out in the open spaces where we prefer to fight and where we optimize our systems to be in these favorable battle spaces. The vast majority of the time, our equipment is just sitting somewhere waiting to be used. That's where it's vulnerable, or the supply chain is vulnerable, or the information system connecting these digital devices is vulnerable. And so the what I see is this mentality that dreams of having World War II like isolation because of our oceans and also because of our economic power, but that doesn't exist anymore. Those advantages are gone, and they're no longer advantages, and yet we pump trillions into tools that don't confer any lasting value for our country. And meanwhile, we're blind to the enemies we're making and the antagonism we spread because there are just so many ways to get back at us.
Yeah, I think that really nails it. And as you say, and actually Wilkerson in a different speech, he noted that we have some kind of, equipment or personnel in 800 bases around the world. I think it's actually more. And he said that if you count up the foreign bases of all the other countries in the world, foreign bases that they have, total, I think he said 78. So, that's crazy just to get a sense of proportion. But the goodwill, which is what we're both sort of alluding to, that means we have in 800 places in the world, we have Americans who are vulnerable to people who fear us, people who now hate us. And, we've created that. We've created that situation.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
One other thing was that the Navy seems to be particularly trying to revive itself. And I remember there was an admiral who was running for Congress, and he talked about the fact that he'd been on a project for downsizing the Navy.
Was this Admiral Sestak?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I know him. Small
Joe.
world. I know him
Yeah.
because I used to rent his townhouse.
Oh, get out.
Yeah.
He was in Pennsylvania,
he was up. No, he had
Virginia.
Yeah, in Old Town. Yeah, he was up. He was from Pennsylvania, and he was in Congress for a term or two, wasn't he? Or did he not? Okay.
Yeah, 2006 to 2010, I think.
Right.
So we were early supporters of his, and so we went to a lot of his rallies and things like that. We talked to him a lot. He talked about the project he was involved in, where I guess the goal wasn't to downsize the Navy. It was just to re-envision the Navy, right? Because as you mentioned in your article, even by World War II at Pearl Harbor, you cite some numbers about battleships that had, we had 8 aircraft carriers and, let me just get your numbers here.
Was it 19 battleships, I want to say?
Yeah, I think it was.
Around the field, yeah.
Yeah, 19 battleships and 8 aircraft carriers. And eight of the battleships were damaged that day, and so on. But what you say is that by that point in time, it was already obvious that battleships were not the future, right? The aircraft carriers were the future. You could argue now that it's even questionable whether they are.
Oh, I absolutely, I do not believe that there's any value in them anymore. And we can get on that. It's another side topic, but no, anyway, I'll let that go. Continue your thought, please.
Yeah. So what Sestak and whatever his team the ideas they came up with were for smaller ships and, ideas that would basically transform the Navy. Correct me if I get any of this wrong, because it's been a while since I read about it or heard him say it. And, even though they came up with very smart and plausible ideas, it didn't sit right with the the establishment in the Navy, and it actually damaged his career. The fact that he put forward this analysis.
Well,
Is that your understanding of it?
I'll say this, that having done lots of analysis of systems and potential operational methods, consider that to be intellectual research and development. So if you're not developing an actual system, you're exploring the plausibility of different combinations of systems. And then, of course, then you try to say, hey, let's invest in this research idea, or if we reconfigure our forces this way and put more money into this gadget or set of gadgets, that implies some, improved performance. So those types of notional studies happen all the time. They're whether you're looking at an existing, like for example, an existing missile that the Navy's had since the 70s, the Harpoon missile, and how do we really haven't upgraded it since the 70s. So the world has changed, and that range is ineffective now. How do we make it go further? So something simple like that, where you take an existing thing, modify it, or you take some magic new thing that doesn't exist yet, and say, if we had this, then we could, it would imply some operational advantage. So those types of things go on all the time. I don't know enough about the maneuverings at the high levels of admirals to know how invested any personality might be in an idea and whether that would undermine their career or not. It
Their
could
pet
be
project.
yeah, but the idea flow is constantly going. But at the same time, as with any large organization, most of the competition is internal. So any new idea is going to compete. It's crossing the chasm is one of the well-known examples in the business literature of an R&D idea kind of getting over that hump of acceptability so that it can slightly mature. There's always going to be, you go back to one of my favorite examples is, Xerox PARC coming up with the mouse and the desktop computer. And of course, the Xerox infrastructure couldn't understand how to really market that, even though they had substantively designed. But Steve Jobs, who went on a tour of the facility, he knew what to do. He had the freedom to move and maneuver because he was just really an independent agent, and Xerox couldn't get out of its own way. And that's a classic story where this institutional inertia and fighting within the organization for resource dollars will submarine new ideas. So sure, the 90s, there was a lot of rethinking going on. What does the end of the Cold War mean? I will say this, that that's right around when I started working in the system on the engineering and analysis side, that while there were lots of different ideas, there were always advocates within the Navy for a blue water war capability to be able to fight a peer that at the time didn't exist. But there were always those champions who saying, hey, we can't forget about war at sea in the classic World War II sense. And they were small voices, particularly once we got into the Gulf Wars and Afghanistan. But they lived on, and so those ideas persist. Any idea that exists today has been thought of last decade, 2 decades ago. All the hype about hypersonic weapons. The U.S. Department of Defense was working on hypersonic weapons in the 50s, and it's a very difficult challenge. So there aren't a lot of really new ideas, but there are new packages of ideas. So an idea to reconfigure, you'll see, hey, let's make smaller carriers so there's not these big juicy targets with 5,000 people on. Let's distribute. Those ideas have been around for a long time. There were forms of that capability back in World War II, but they don't exist. And I'll say this, one of the strongest influences inside the weapons development system is it's these kind of business mentality. So come up with an idea and show me the life cycle cost for 30 years. That's how we get into things like the F-35. It's not that it was all that great by itself. It was just, we're going to make a bunch of these. They're going to replace a bunch of different other aircraft types, and we'll have this one thing, and we'll kind of continually invest in it, and it's upgrading. And we can all understand a little bit about consistency. If you had a small business and you had a infotech network you wanted to set up, it would be easier to maintain and manage if you use the same servers and the same printers. But if you tried to kludge together all of these different devices from different eras, that's
we hate
can
that.
be problematic.
That's a nightmare. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not a great example, but you can see some of these internal forces they're not just political. Some of them are, well, you got to make the business case. And of course, whenever you're trying to make a business case about something that doesn't exist for, DOD, there's nothing in 5 years. It might be 10, 20, 30. Try to predict that life cycle cost. And when you're fighting for plan A versus plan B, that definitely becomes political. But all the underlying numbers on that, I mean, take your pick. It's just who puts together the best case, because there are estimates, and they're estimates based on assumptions, and those are always in flux, and those are always up to challenge. So then it becomes a political battle on whose idea wins on. But what I've seen is in no cases does money not get spent. It will always be spent one way or another.
Right. But is it true that there's great resistance in doing away with these huge battleships, though?
Oh, sure. I mean, you can still read articles in recent years about bringing back the battleships. In the 90s, there was a concept called the arsenal ship, which was designed to be a replacement because everyone was whining about the World War II era 4 battleships being decommissioned. Oh, we don't need that. We're going to have these smart weapons on these barges. Nowadays, you'll see
lasers. Now we're going to have lasers.
Yeah, all that stuff. I mean, it's always futuristic down the road. One of my biggest kind of personal peeves is the so-called railgun project, and there's been a lot of R&D in 2 years to get this billet of tungsten out an electromagnetic railgun and shoot it very far distances. That shooting it has shown to be, at least in an R&D sense, possible. But where does it go, right? How does it guide to its end point? And so we all can imagine that if you're shooting something 1 foot, a milliradian or something, a fraction of a degree off, doesn't matter. But if it's going a mile, it will really matter. Yeah. And that's the problem with the railgun. And it drives me nuts when I hear pundits talk about how the railgun is, there's lots of sci-fi just around the corner to justify doing the same old thing. But so you'll still read stories about needing battleships. And of course, there's still a very strong constituency with the carriers. It's a big, prominent platform, but we have very few of them, and we have limitations. We have mostly Hornet family, Boeing Hornet family aircraft on there. Hornets are being used as refueling tankers, which is ridiculous to be using a frontline fighter to carry gas cans around. But we've gotten rid of all the other support planes on board the ship. And so now the Navy, after decades of endless studies, I've worked on a lot of these studies to come up with an unmanned concept for a carrier. I've come up with this MQ-25 Stingray idea. Its primary purpose is to be a tanker, and just to try to save some flight hours off of the Hornets that were burning at a huge rate, because we don't have any other aircraft to do that very mundane mission.
Yeah, there are some big flaws like that you just.
Well, I think
just kind of stunning. Yeah.
Well, and as you know, as a technical person, that there's always these implications that whatever plan you have or whatever design you have is based on a stack of assumptions, and then there are other outside consequences to making your design choices. So some things will be optimized, and the problem is with this drive to come up with the best plan for the 30-year life cycle or whatever, and you end up making a lot of really fine assumptions. Of course, none of the assumptions are true, because the cost overruns are always happen. Yeah. But the point is, at some decision-making point, it will be the most persuasive, even though as wrong as it is. But even with all those embedded errors, whether they're, I'm convinced that most of the time it's just you can't know that much about the future. You can't, but you have to make a decision. So, this technology is really immature, but let's just pretend that things go well. And a classic example, just 2 months ago, There was an outbrief at CNAS from a RAND study, and Bob Work and the RAND analysts were talking about, well, if we just spent $8 billion for the Air Force, we could sink every Chinese Navy ship.
Yeah.
Madness, right? It's that level of lack is a technical person who understands all of the assumptions that going into the whole system that we require to find and shoot and actually sink or damage every Chinese ship. I mean, it's an outrageous concept, but there's so many
instantaneously or something that they're never going to fight back or whatever.
But you're right, and they're not, and once that knockout blow, like everyone in Japan, Yamamoto is like, don't bomb the Americans. You're just gonna make them mad, and that's not going to be good for us. Which is exactly what happened. There's no such thing as a knockout blow. It's not going to happen. So the premise is operationally ridiculous, but it's just the superficial technical comprehension of really what it takes. You can't possibly know that it's going to take $8 billion or whatever a year for X number of years to do all this. There's so much that's unknown. I think it's grossly irresponsible to even make such claims. But you see all that stuff. It's all part of the war of persuasion, and there's just so many unknowns. And when you make certain design choices to come down a certain path, there's all these other things that you've foregone, or there are going to be these unintended consequences, or these things that were overlooked in favor of the plan, that you get into situations where we're burning huge amounts of fighter aircraft time just to be a tanker. It's madness.
Yeah, that is. And it's, we also have situations like the Arleigh Burke class destroyers where we had 4 of them in collisions, and was that a 2-year period?
You have to wonder. I mean, not to pile on.
I can't believe those stories. Yeah.
Well, ProPublica did a lot of great work on that, and it just seems like if the Navy can't keep its commercially based AIS system up and running to help navigating through crowded waters, how are we going to fight? There's always this magic assumption, and this used to drive me crazy as an analyst. We would plan scenarios for 10 years and go, well, what's going to happen? So let's get the things that we know today in their performance. Let's get the magic new thing and let's test it out. And what really drove me crazy was why we know what the readiness state is today. We know how much money goes into keeping our ships and planes operational, what our weapons inventories are. And why do we think in 10 years, everything's going to work, right? Why is it always going to be, it's actually going to be 10 years worse then, given.
Well, here's the question I ask is we just spent, 15, in some cases, 19 years operating in the Middle East. Why do we think that our adversaries in the region aren't just, studying and observing and finding vulnerabilities in our systems, and that we're going to remain so superior that people aren't going to find ways to undermine us in sort of, I forget. I can't think of the.
You're absolutely right. So we've fought everyone we've been fighting. They've been strategically very sophisticated, more sophisticated than us, arguably. Technologically, no, but we have this prejudice towards the technological solution. But what have we been doing in recent years? We've been in Syria with our F-22s, with our F-35s, and who else is in Syria?
We're flying our stuff all around.
Right.
Why do we not think that they're not intensely studying our systems?
Absolutely. Of course they are. We're flying in the Baltic area where the Russians are. We're flying in the Western Pacific where the Chinese are. Absolutely. Of course they are. And who knows what is going on domestically. So, right. So the presence we have, the idea that let's be somewhere. Well, you're right. You're giving people an opportunity to study you. We drop so many bombs everywhere that these things are not all vaporized. So lots of our pieces and components, I would love to see a study on this. There must be a black market in there's a black market arms industry, but there must be a black market in U.S. weapons components from drones and aircraft and munitions that haven't blown up. So there's a lot of technology transfer going over there. Of course, foreign military sales is a big move to keep production lines open, and so we subsidize our domestic arms industry by selling stuff,
right,
and giving it an aid. Again, that when things go out, who knows who gets to see our stuff? So all this panic about the technology gap. We're feeding that. We're shoveling coal into the maw of learning because we're educating every possible adversary by our presence, by our distribution of arms and equipment and operating methods throughout the world. And then not to mention anything that goes on domestically. We have lots of people that come from overseas to study. If you look at academic journal databases, there is an enormous wealth of academic scholarship coming out of Chinese universities in English. And it blows my mind. Can you imagine U.S. academic publications going out to the world in Chinese or another language? I can't. And just the sophistication that applies to not only be that productive, but to be that productive in not just technology, humanities, economics, and in another language that shows a very high level of sophistication. And I just think it's a mythology that we have this superiority because we're contributing to its evaporation every day.
Right. And I guess the thing that worries me is, and this is speculation on my part, but with the situation with the collisions, if that was someone taking advantage of one of our vulnerabilities, we are just intensely unwilling to admit it. And I just wonder if we can really fix problems if we're not. I mean, I understand you can't.
No, I'll say that in these particular cases, there's been certainly speculation about that, and even a couple of articles written on it. I don't believe that was the case here, but certainly that will be possible. So it will absolutely drive me crazy when I hear this late 90s digital future fashion of connecting everything. This network-centric warfare has come back. The future combat system, all this integrated sensor shooter ideas from 20 years ago are back and stronger than ever now. And yet we're not 20 years ago when we could all have open websites without security. There's so much more digital sophistication now that I think every time you build a new digital system, you build new vulnerabilities. And again, it's that last war-ism. It's that old mentality that is easy to think of and conceive of on PowerPoint, but it just doesn't endure, and it's building in vulnerabilities. But when you think, we have this primacy of these systems, and that's the way forward, I don't know. I'm not sure if people actually believe it or if it's just conventional. It's easy to not disagree, and then it keeps the jobs and money going. It just doesn't seem plausible that somebody would buy in to old ideas being viable in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, anyone who has been involved in developing sophisticated systems, whether it be software or weapon systems in which there is a lot of software, you know that the more sophisticated the system is, the more wide the network is where it's deployed, the more different things you have cobbled together to make a whole system work. It's almost impossible for there not to be vulnerabilities. It is impossible, I would say. Technically, it's not absolutely impossible, but what it would take to test all of those kinds of systems, plus you're talking about tests that are destructive tests. They're very expensive. They're not plausible to do in some cases, particularly with weapon systems.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's just, and it seems like there are fewer and fewer people who can even conceive of what goes into developing these kinds and producing these kinds of systems. So
you've absolutely hit on it. So the idea of how do we test this in a realistic manner when you have these networked swarming drones or missiles that communicate with each other? No one's gonna pay for that. You see the budget as large as it is, and yet we're invested in yesterday. We're invested in the past. There's almost no margin for future ideas. Sure, there's going to be experiments. There's always going to be a little bit of R&D. But how do you gain confidence that a system is going to work, a very complicated system is going to work? Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's not going to be any tolerance or appetite at the financial level to try to test that out. And so imagine how crazy that is. Here's your car. It's brand new. No, we didn't really test it that much. Buy it, take it off into the street. Crazy. But we do that all the time with our systems and that's what Wilkerson got to. He said when the operating forces know that what gets fielded is crap, heroic levels of effort and spare parts can go in to keep anything going. One aircraft out of a whole squadron or a handful. We know what the readiness rates are. That was a big problem with the collisions in the Western Pacific. We have lots of equipment. A lot of the ships sit pier side. Hey, we need to get them out there to do whatever we want to do. And yet they go out with deficiencies in training, in equipment maintenance, and problems will accrue. And again, going back to my own personal experience, it would just drive me crazy when I would look at some scenario in 10 years and try to play everything out and go, well, why are we expecting all of these systems to be available and ready in this time? I call it a house of cards. The house of cards will work from time to time, but if any type of factors attempt to undermine the house of cards, then none of it works.
Yeah, and it's the other thing that bothers me is that I don't want to this to come out the wrong way, but people who don't have any level of competence in understanding these systems, either they're sitting from on high, or they're from an arm's length distance, and they're just poo-pooing, saying how could you screw things up like this? But they don't understand the complexity, the absolute inability to test certain things, whether it be a weapon system where you're putting people's lives at risk, where you're having to destroy things to test things, or I spent some time in the Wall Street IT industry. When there are things like real financial transactions or transactions that affect a market, you can build sandboxes that emulate the real system. But sometimes you put software out, but once you put it out in the real world, in the wild, you can't completely emulate things, and it's a risk every single time.
Absolutely.
In complex and highly, big, risky environments, some of this stuff is literally not completely tested until it gets out into what we call production, into the production world. So,
I completely agree. And a great example is really trivial stuff. It'll just be analog to digital conversion. So there are sensors, for an aircraft, you might have air pressure sensors or old ideas from 100 years ago, the dawn of flight. And you'll have a little transducer that will take that analog signal and it will convert it. Well, there's all kinds of assumptions baked into that, and it's not the actual signal. And so if I'm going to test something, I'm not going to test. I can't really fly a new thing around and create actual real atmospheric information. So I'm going to write up a little code that's going to emulate it. Well, what is it not going to have? It's kind of like those audiophile arguments between digital compression and vinyl, and I still have some vinyl. So I like the pluses and minuses to both. Point is, they're not exactly the same. You will have maybe narrowed the operating range. You won't have the noise that you have, and that's just one little sub element of a analog to digital conversion. And you start stacking all those things up, and you're right, it does drive me crazy when people will speak with authority and they don't have technical insight. And this could be whether they're military leaders, politicians, pundits, advocates, and there's, I understand championing an idea, but at the same time, be circumspect and realize that, yes, in certain House of Cards situations, that lash up will work, but it's also very risky because a lot of times, in most scenarios, that House of Cards does not align. And then you have a system that you thought was a general purpose system, and no, it really only works in that House of Cards stack of variables.
So to try to wrap this up, toward the end of your article, you say the Pentagon is a hierarchy fixated on technology. It's unequipped to confront a world of disruptive challenges because it's focused on the past, not the future, and mainly on the money. The U.S. military is an old-fashioned military holding on to World War II era ideas about the value of kinetic force. I mean, you say some other things in the end there, but just to sort of speculate on our own about, I don't know, what we're really getting at here. We're in an extremely complex world. We are a declining empire. We have people who dream of the kind of dominance that Wilkerson talked about that we had in post World War II. Some of them might even be crazy enough to try to trigger another world war, thinking that they could do a big reset, that there's some kind of a big reset button. I mean, I hear some people talking. I think they do have that kind of a mindset. But I think that what we are alluding to is that we need to let go of these things, and we need to think about the real world as it is, not only in weapon systems, but just in relations with other people. That this, I guess, what I've been saying for a long time, I'm not a military expert, but I think it is obvious to a layperson who's paying attention that what it boils down to is this isn't sustainable. We just can't keep doing this. We're heading down a really bad path where if we try to sustain this dominance, it's already, as Wilkerson said, it's already eating us alive.
Well,
and it could be worse. It can only get worse unless we stop, take a look around and say, all right, this is no longer sustainable. We need to change course.
Yeah, I'll say this. Personally, I don't really have a real prescriptive position or mentality. My experience in trying to improve the value of putting, a weapon in a certain geolocation. Okay, we figured that out. We don't have to carpet bomb anymore to hit a single point in space. So, okay, that's interesting. But the problem is that the world has moved on. So if there ever was any value to being able to do that, and I'm a big critic of air power theory, and I've studied it a lot. I think a lot of those ideas that were very influential, even before World War II, live on very strongly. But the idea that technically in certain situations where there's not a lot of threat to our equipment and people, we can put a device within a few meters of a target. Okay, sure. But what does that get you? And if we can't compel the Taliban, for example, let's forget about Al-Qaeda. What about the Taliban? Are they changing their ways? No, they've got us on the ropes. So what makes anyone think that we're going to compel China or Russia, who have certainly a very expansive sense of their place in the world and history, that a few bombs are going to make any difference to them at all? It's not. It's ludicrous to think that, and yet we invest heavily in it. So I really just want to kind of make that point that we're investing in this old-fashioned notions of what a good military would be, and that day is, if it ever existed, it's surely gone now. In order to wrap up the piece, I drew on a really great Venn diagram at Red Team Journal. If you've gone to that link, I think it's fantastic. It really shows the mentality, the technocentric mentality, and then of course the technology first, then money, and then a little bit of strategy. I thought that was a really elegant way to kind of show the overarching conventional mentality. And then that very last quote came from a pretty insightful piece at Defense One, which tends to be a very kind of championing military industrial site, but it's always worth checking out.
Yeah, I agree.
This was a skeptical article, and I really liked that because it kind of reinforced what I was drawing on with Red Team, and then I was able to kind of use that to show that really, I think, again, I'm not sure if there are leaders who really believe. There's probably a few, Dr. Strangelove types. There are probably a few Bob Works out there who may really believe that it's going to do something if we sank every Chinese ship. I don't know how you could possibly think that, given what we've failed to do in all of these other much less sophisticated countries with our kinetic capability. So to me, that's just crazy. But so maybe that's an anomalous. The point is, those systems don't add up, and so what's kind of the explanation? What's the Well, it's inertia, and it's money. So let's focus on the past. Those systems were good. They're prominent. We have aircraft carriers and no one else does, or they don't have many. And let's just keep throwing money at the things we used to think we were good at and just keep it going. I think it's really short-term thinking. I almost think that there's no future thinking whatsoever at the decision-making level. So your experience with Joe Sestak, he's championing an idea. Hey, how do we shift? Well, that got buried because maybe it was too controversial, too radical for the future. But I don't think that the pushback really was about 20, 30 years from now. It was probably about today. We don't want to start shifting in that way because it might mean one less, Arleigh Burke class or one less Ford class carrier. I tend to think that the attention span is much shorter term, and anything that serves as a pretext to go forward is what's grabbed at. I think it's chaotic.
Yeah, and the inertia, as you mentioned before, it's just crippled by it. We're crippled by inertia. I just hope it doesn't take a catastrophic event to move that ship that is, as a metaphor. Yeah.
Without naming him, I'll pass on something my old boss at the analysis shop used to say, and he had been a Navy operations analyst for 30 years, and he used to invoke Mike Tyson quote all the time. And Tyson at one point apparently had said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And so the point my old boss was trying to make, just his experience leading up to where we are today, is it's going to take a punch in the mouth, not a 9/11 thing, where horrifically a bunch of people died, but let's put it into kind of a cost benefit context, 4,000 people in the context of all the other forms of death that occur every year in the US. It wasn't that consequential. So I'm not sure if he knew what he meant by punch in the mouth, but to me, It was something much more consequential than a 9/11 before our behavior would really substantively change.
Well, on that happy note.
Yeah, it's not trying to be optimistic, just passing it on. I'll just throw one more thing out there. So we've heard posturing by series of presidents. We're not going to do this. We're circumspect. We're not going to nation build. We're going to get out of these stupid wars, and yet none of them do. Right? They expand it. The guys who posture about being against dumb wars get us into more. Right? That's the trend in the past 20 years. So I don't know.
Well, one thing that we do know is that the people in this country don't want more wars and more interventions. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And millions, or tens of millions at the very least, of people are trying to communicate that in every way that they can. We had the opposition to the war in Iraq. It was very visible, very vocal. It didn't change anything, but it was out there. We had in 2013, when Obama was going to bomb Syria, Wilkerson talks about the way that Congress was overwhelmed by people who showed up in person, emailed, called, faxed. They were overwhelmed by the response. And then you have the 2016 election, where the guy who claimed that he would keep us out of wars or get us out of wars, reduce the number of bases, got elected in an unimaginable outcome to an election. And now there's conventional wisdom among politicians that Americans don't care about foreign policy. That's been the conventional wisdom for decades now. And now even the think tank that's really the Democratic Party, called the Center for American Progress, has just come out with a study that says, oh, we were wrong. The American people do care about foreign policy. And I just saw a podcast where it's pretty hilarious. I'll link it in the show notes, where they're talking about, I guess we were wrong about that conventional wisdom. So, maybe it's the people themselves that can force this change. Right now, it seems almost impossible for average Americans to affect policy because there's so much wealth and power driving those policies. But I think that's, other than a punch in the nose, I think that's the only other way that we're going to change, course on this ship of state. But I guess we'll see, and we'll do little things we can along the way. It's kind of what we're doing here. So I'll leave that a little bit of optimism. Leave us with a little bit of optimism there.
Well, I think it starts with, information, and anybody who can help counter the simplistic, the simple-minded narratives that we get out of the news cycle and the champions for the conventional wisdom. I think that's obviously a plus, right? Action is not going to come out of a vacuum. It's going to require some, informed motivation. So I don't feel like I have all that much to say, but from time to time, I think I can contribute a little something, just given my, fairly rare set of experiences and knowledge. And I think if everybody can try to counter the conventional wisdom narrative, then that certainly can be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And you wrote that article, thousands of people read it, I read it, and now we're talking, and now more thousands of people are going to hear us talking. And so I think we each can do, whatever we can. We don't have to come up with an idea to change the world. We just need to use the skills that we have, and do the little things that we can do and fit into our own lives, and hope that it has a ripple effect. And that's what we're doing. All right. Well, Dave, thank you so much. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
I appreciate the chance to talk, and I look forward to keeping in touch. From time to time, I may have another idea. I'm working on some stuff on defense spending right now, and with a focus on our comparative spending with China, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk again. But anyway,
that'd be great.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Dave Foster. Find Dave's writing at antiwar.com. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Hey, I'd like to offer special thanks to my long-term patrons, new patrons, and contributors, and also to everybody who's messaged me with suggestions and feedback. It makes a big difference to me, and I appreciate it. The audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire. It's where we have the most traffic. There are many ways to listen to it. Find it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. Working on a new look and new kinds of content, including video content, and I'd really like your help building up that YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.